When I opened my eyes, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the ordinary kind of silence. Like when you wake up too early and the world hasn't stirred yet, but a suffocating, unnatural absence of sound. No hum of distant traffic, no faint ticking of a clock, nothing. The second thing I noticed was that I wasn't in my room. The walls around me were stark white, featureless, and without windows. The air smelled faintly, of antiseptic, sharp and metallic. I was lying on a cold metal floor, fully clothed but without my shoes or anything in my pockets. My phone, my wallet gone. I sat up, the disorientation hitting me like a wave. That's when I saw a single piece of paper lying in the middle of the floor. I crawled toward it, my heart pounding in my chest. The note was handwritten in bold, jagged letters. The game begins now. Survive if you can. What the hell, I whispered, my voice cracking in the oppressive stillness. My words felt heavy, as if they didn't belong in this place. That's when I saw the timer. It was on the wall, glowing in blood-red numbers 23:57:32. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, whatever this was. It had a time limit. I stood up, my knees shaky, and scanned the room for any sign of an exit. My eyes fell on a metal door embedded in the far wall. It had no handle or lock, just a smooth surface and a small seam where it met the frame. As I approached, the door slid open with a hiss, revealing a narrow corridor beyond. The corridor was dimly lit, with walls covered in strange, twisting symbols. They looked like a mix of ancient hieroglyphs and crude scribbles, none of which made any sense to me. The air was colder here, and as I stepped through the doorway, I noticed something odd. The door behind me had vanished. I was trapped. A faint whispering sound broke the silence, so soft I almost thought I was imagining it. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I strained to make out the words, but they were indistinct, like a foreign language spoken just out of earshot. I took a step forward, and that's when it happened. You've broken the first rule. The voice came from nowhere, low and mechanical, reverberating in my head like a thunderclap. Before I could react, the floor beneath me shifted, and a section of it collapsed with a deafening clang. I stumbled backward just in time to avoid falling into the black void below. My heart raced as I realized the ground ahead was riddled with similar hidden traps, waiting for me to make another wrong move. I froze, panic threatening to overwhelm me. What rule had I broken? I didn't even know the rules. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't a game with instructions. It was a game of trial and error. The rules were hidden, unwritten, and every step I took could lead to disaster. I needed to be careful. I knelt down, studying the floor in front of me. The symbols on the wall seemed to glow faintly. Now, their twisted shapes pulsating with an unnatural light. Were they a clue? I hesitated, then tested the ground with my foot. When nothing happened, I took a cautious step forward, then another. The whispering grew louder, the air around me thickening with tension. That's when I saw a faint marking on the floor ahead, shaped like a jagged X. It was subtle, almost invisible in the dim light, but something about it screamed danger. I stepped around it, my breath hitching as the floor remained intact. Okay, I whispered, my voice trembling. I can do this. The corridor stretched on endlessly, each step feeling heavier than the last. The symbols on the walls seemed to shift as I moved, morphing into new shapes that made less sense than the ones before. I felt like I was being watched, though I couldn't see or hear anything that would confirm it. After what felt like hours, I came to a fork in the path. Two corridors stretched out before me, identical in every way. Above them, carved into the wall, was a simple riddle. Speak not, and pass. Whisper, and they will hear. I stared at the words, trying to make sense of them. Was it literal? If I stayed silent, would I be safe? Or was it some kind of trick? The whispering around me grew louder, more insistent, as if urging me to choose. My hands trembled as I weighed my options. Finally, I decided to test the left corridor. I took a step forward, keeping my mouth shut, my breath shallow and controlled. The whispering seemed to fade, replaced by a faint hum. I kept moving, the tension easing with every silent step. I was beginning to think I'd chosen correctly when the sound of soft laughter echoed through the corridor behind me. I froze, my stomach twisting into knots. The laughter was wrong, childlike, but distorted, as if it were being played on a broken record. Don't turn around, I whispered to myself, my voice shaking. The laughter stopped. The voice from before echoed in my head, you've broken the second rule. I ran. By the time I reached the end of the corridor, my lungs were burning, and my legs felt like jelly. A metal door slid open ahead of me, and I stumbled through, collapsing onto the floor. The room was identical to the one I'd started in, except for one difference: the timer on the wall. Now read 1832:47. 5 hours had passed. On the floor in front of me was another note, written in the same jagged handwriting as the first. Congratulations on surviving the first round. The game isn't over yet. I stared at the note, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. Somewhere in the silence, the whispering began again. I lay on the cold floor of the room, staring at the note as the whispers grew louder, surrounding me like an unseen crowd. My heart pounded as I reread the words "congratulations on surviving the first round. The game isn't over yet." The timer on the wall blinked ominously. 1832:46. It wasn't relief I felt, it was dread. The first round had nearly killed me, and I still had 18 hours to go. But there was no way out. The door I'd entered through had vanished again, leaving me trapped with the timer and my thoughts. A sharp, metallic click echoed through the room. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. A new door slid open, revealing another dark corridor. This time, the symbols on the walls weren't just glowing, they were pulsating, casting faint, flickering light across the passage. I wanted to stay where I was, to refuse to play, but the timer on the wall began to tick faster, the numbers racing downward. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline propelling me forward. Whatever was waiting for me, I had no choice but to face it. This corridor was narrower than the first, the air heavier. The whispers that had haunted me in the previous round were gone, replaced by a rhythmic tapping sound, like fingernails drumming against metal. It was faint at first, but as I moved deeper into the corridor, it grew louder, sharper. The walls were different, too. Instead of symbols, they were lined with mirrors. At first, I tried not to look at them, focusing on the path ahead. But as the tapping grew louder, the mirrors began to draw my attention. My reflection wasn't right. It moved out of sync with me, lingering for a split second after I passed each mirror before snapping back into place. Its face was mine, but distorted, stretched, and warped. The eyes too. Large, the mouth too wide. Don't look too long, I told myself, forcing my gaze forward. But then I reached the end of the corridor and realized there was no door. I turned around, my chest tightening. The mirrors stretched endlessly behind me, flickering with distorted reflections of myself. The tapping sound stopped, replaced by a low growl that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I took a hesitant step back the way I'd come, glancing at the mirrors despite myself. My reflection was no longer alone. Behind me, in the glass, stood a shadowy figure. Its limbs were long and thin, its face featureless. Except for a pair of glowing, hollow eyes. I didn't think. I ran. I sprinted back through the corridor, the mirrors blurring into streaks of light as I passed them. The shadow and the reflections followed me, its movements unnatural, jerking like a marionette on tangled strings. The tapping started again, louder now, echoing in rhythm with my footsteps. I reached the end of the corridor and stopped dead. The mirrors were gone, replaced by a single door marked with a new riddle. Choose the price to pay: light or time. The tapping stopped abruptly, the silence so sudden it felt like a weight pressing down on me. Looked at the door, then at the timer on my wrist. It was still ticking down, now reading 16:45:10, light or time. The words repeated in my head as I tried to decipher their meaning. Did it mean the time on my wrist? Did it mean darkness? I reached for the door, hesitant, and pressed against it. The room plunged into pitch black. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. The air felt heavier here, pressing down on my chest. And the whispers returned closer now, as if they were circling me. Then the voice came again, louder this time: you chose light. Now they will take their price. I spun around, heart pounding, as the whispers grew deafening. Shapes moved in the darkness, shifting and twisting like smoke. My flashlight flickered on, casting a weak beam across the room. They were everywhere. Shadowy figures slithered across the walls, their glowing eyes fixed on me. Their mouths didn't move, but their whispers filled the room, overlapping into a chaotic hum. I took a step back, clutching the flashlight like it could save me. The light flickered again, and the shadows surged forward. Stay back, I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. The flashlight died, plunging me into silence. When I woke up, I was back in the original room. The timer was gone. The door was gone. The note was gone, but I wasn't alone. The shadowy figures from the mirrors stood in the corners of the room, watching me with their hollow, glowing eyes. They didn't move, didn't whisper. They just stood there, waiting. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. My hands trembled as I backed away, pressing myself against the wall. The figures moved in unison, stepping forward as one. And then I understood. The game wasn't about surviving. It was about joining. I am still here, writing this in the hope that someone will find it. The game isn't over. It never ends. If you're reading this, know that the rules are unwritten for a reason. And if you ever wake up in a strange room with a timer on the wall, don't play. No one wins. Could you survive a game where the rules are unwritten? Share how you would. Figure out the rules in the comments. The first time Mrs. Hargrove mentioned it, I thought she was joking. I just moved into the neighborhood. A quiet little cul-de-sac tucked away from the noise of the, city. My new house was modest but cozy, with a big bay window in the living room and a small garden out back. It was exactly the kind of place I needed to get my life together after years of apartment hopping and unstable jobs. Mrs. Hargrove, my next-door neighbor, was one of the first people to welcome me. She was in her 70s, sharp-eyed and spry despite her age, with a knack for baking pies that she often shared with me. I liked her immediately, even if she had a habit of saying things that bordered on strange. That night, I'd invited her over for tea as a thank you for the welcome pie she'd brought earlier in the week. We sat at my small dining table, the scent of chamomile filling the room as she recounted stories about the neighborhood's history. I listened, amused but only half paying attention, until her tone shifted. "You'll do fine here," she said, staring at her tea. "Just remember one thing. If someone knocks on your door after 10 p.m., don't answer it. Don't even speak to them." I laughed nervously, unsure if she was serious. Why not? Her gaze lifted to meet mine, her eyes unusually grave. Because it's not someone you want to let in. The room seemed to grow colder, the air heavy with unspoken tension. "What do you mean?" I asked, leaning forward. Mrs. Hargrove hesitated, her fingers tightening around the teacup. "Years ago we had incidents. People would hear knocks late at night. Some opened the door, and those who did." She stopped, her lips pressing into a thin line. "What happened to them?" "They were never the same," she said quietly. "Sometimes they disappeared altogether. Other times they stayed, but something about them was wrong, off." A chill ran down my spine, but I forced a smile, trying to brush off the unease. "Sounds like something out of a ghost story." "It's not a story," she snapped, her voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. Then she softened, reaching across the table to grip my hand. "Promise me you won't answer the door. No matter who it sounds like, no matter what they say." Her urgency unnerved me. I nodded, more to placate her than out of belief. "I promise." She left shortly after that, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I tried to shake off Mrs. Hargrove's warning. I told myself she was just an old woman with an overactive imagination, probably influenced by too many late-night horror movies. By 9:30 I was curled up on the couch, watching a sitcom and scrolling through my phone. I wasn't thinking about her warning anymore, until 10:15 rolled around. The first knock was soft. I paused the show, the remote halfway to the coffee table. Maybe I'd imagined it. I waited. The house suddenly too quiet. Then it came again, a little louder this time. I froze, my pulse quickening. Mrs. Hargrove's words echoed in my mind, "Don't answer it. Don't even speak to them." Rising slowly from the couch, I crept toward the front door. The hallway leading to it felt longer than usual, the shadows deeper. My heart pounded as I reached the door, pressing my eye to the peephole. Nothing. The porch light illuminated the front yard, but there was no one there. No shadow of movement. No sign of anyone nearby. I stepped back, confusion mingling with unease. Then the knock came again, louder, more near, insistent. My breath caught in my throat. "Who's there?" I called out before I could stop myself. The knocking stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than before, pressing against my ears like static. I stared at the door, waiting, but no one answered. After a long moment, I turned the deadbolt and backed away, locking the door as I went. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, flinching at every creak and groan of the house. I convinced myself it had been a prank, a kid playing ding-dong ditch, or a delivery driver at the wrong address. But the unease lingered. The next evening, I triple-checked the locks before settling in for the night. I left the hallway, Light on. My phone within arm's reach. At exactly 10:15, the knocking started again. This time it was louder. 3 deliberate knocks, spaced evenly apart. My blood ran cold as I stared at the door, the memory of Mrs. Hargrove's warning filling my mind. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The knocking came again, more forceful. I reached for my phone, my hands trembling, and dialed Mrs. Hargrove's number. She answered. On the second ring, her voice groggy. "It's happening. Isn't it?" she asked without preamble. "What do?" I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. "Stay quiet," she said firmly. "Don't open the door. Don't even let them know you're there." A sudden, sharp knock made me flinch, the sound echoing through the house. "Stay away from the door," Mrs. Hargrove said. "Whatever happens, don't." The call cut out. The knocking continued, growing more frantic. I backed into the living room, clutching my phone like a lifeline. The sound seemed to reverberate through the walls, shaking the house. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I sat in the silence, too afraid to move, until dawn crept through the windows. Only then did I dare to approach the door. When I looked through the peephole, the porch was empty. But there was something on the ground, a folded piece of paper, weighted down with a small rock. My stomach churned as I opened the door just enough to grab it. The paper was blank except for 3 words, scrawled in jagged handwriting. "We'll come back." I spent the next day in a haze of paranoia. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of wind outside made my heart race. I couldn't get the note out of my mind. "We'll come back," it felt like a promise, one I wasn't sure I'd survive. By the time evening rolled around, I was armed with every defense I could think of. I'd bolted the door, pulled the curtains, and left every light in the house blazing. My phone sat charged on the table beside me, Mrs. Hargrove's number queued up, just in case. The hours ticked by. At 10, I sat frozen in the armchair, staring at the door. I held my breath. As the clock struck 10:15, the knocking came again. It started softly like the night before, 3 deliberate knocks. I stayed perfectly still, gripping the arms of the chair. "Don't let them know you're here," Mrs. Hargrove had warned. But then the knocks changed. They became uneven, frantic, like fists pounding on the door. I clenched my jaw, refusing to move. Then came the whispers. At first I thought they were just in my head, faint and fragmented, like someone muttering in or another room. But they grew louder, clearer. "Let us in." The voice was wrong. It was layered, like several people speaking in unison, all slightly out of sync. "Let us in," it repeated, the words scraping against my ears. I bit down hard on my lip, tasting blood, fighting the urge to scream. The air around me grew colder, and the faint smell of damp earth seeped into the room. The knocking stopped, but the whispers continued. Then, something new happened. "Please," the voice said, shifting into something softer. It sounded familiar. My heart stopped. It was my sister's voice. "Emily, it's me. Please open the door." I gripped the armrests tighter, my mind spinning. My sister lived 2 states away, and we hadn't spoken in weeks. There was no way she could be here, no way she could know what was happening. But the voice sounded so real. "Emily, I'm scared," it continued, trembling with fear. "Please. I don't know where I am. I need you." I felt tears running down my face as I fought against the overwhelming urge to run to the door. "No," I whispered to myself, shaking my head. "It's not her." The voice grew louder, more desperate. "Please, Emily. Don't leave me out here." I clamped my hands over my ears, rocking back and forth in the chair. "It's not her. It's not her." Then the voice changed again. "Open the door, Emily." It was no longer pleading. It was cold, sharp, dripping with malice. "Open the door," it commanded, the words echoing through the house. The lights in the house flickered, casting strange shadows across the walls. The whispers rose to a cacophony, voices overlapping and twisting into inhuman screeches. Then came the sound of splintering wood. I shot out of the chair, staring at the door in horror. Deep cracks spread across the wood, as though something on the other side was clawing at it. "Let us in," the voices roared, shaking the walls. I stumbled back, knocking over the table. My phone skidded across the floor, out of reach. The door buckled, the deadbolt straining against the force. For a moment, I thought it would give way. But then, as quickly as it began, the assault stopped. The silence was deafening. I stood there, trembling, my eyes fixed on the battered door. The cracks were still there, deep and jagged, but whatever had been trying to get in was gone. Or so I thought. The next morning I went straight to Mrs. Hargrove's house. She opened the door before I could even knock, her face pale and lined with worry. "They came last night," I said, my voice hoarse. She nodded solemnly, gesturing for me to come inside. Over cups of tea, she told me the full story. "It started decades ago," she said, staring into her cup. "No one knows where they came from. Some say it's a curse. Others say it's something older, something this place woke up. But they've always followed the same pattern. The knocks, the voices. They'll do anything to make you open the door." I shuddered. "What happens if you let them in?" Mrs. Hargrove's hands trembled as she set her cup down. "You disappear. Or worse, you don't disappear, but you're not you anymore. They take something from you. A piece of your soul. Your humanity. You become one of them." Her words chilled me to the core. "Why me?" I asked. "Why now?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Sometimes they fixate on certain people. Sometimes it's random. But once they start, they don't stop." I prepared for them. I reinforced the door with every piece of furniture I could find, leaving no space for them to force their way in. The cracks from the night before remained, a stark reminder of how close they'd come. At 10:15, the knocking started. I sat in the armchair, gripping a baseball bat, my heart hammering in my chest. The whispers came again, louder this time, more insistent. They called my name, mimicked voices I loved, pleaded, begged, threatened. The walls shook. The lights flickered. But I didn't move. "Let us in," they screamed, their voices a monstrous chorus. The door began to splinter, but I held firm, chanting Mrs. Hargrove's words in my head. "Don't answer. Don't let them know you're there." The chaos continued until just before dawn. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. When the sun rose, I cautiously approached the door. The wood was nearly shattered, the locks barely holding. On the porch, a note waited for me, written in the same jagged handwriting. "We'll come back. They haven't returned yet, but I know it's only a matter of time. Mrs. Hargrove says they always come back." I've started reinforcing the windows, installing new locks, doing whatever I can to keep them out. But deep down, I know it won't be enough. If you ever hear knocking after 10 p.m., don't answer it. Don't speak to it. Don't even look. Because once they find you, they won't stop. What would you do if someone knocked on your door after 10 p.m.? Share your survival strategy in the comments. It all started with the code of conduct. At my high school, everyone treated it like a joke. It was a booklet handed out on the first day of freshman year, filled with the usual stuff about dress codes, tardiness policies, and phone usage rules. But there were a few sections that always stood out, rules so bizarre and specific that they became running gags among students. Do not enter the East Wing after 6 p.m. If the bell rings twice in succession, return to your classroom immediately. Never touch the red lockers, even if one is open. People laughed about them, made up urban legends, or dared each other to break them. Nobody seemed to take them seriously, not even the teachers. I'd always thought the rules were just some quirky relic of the school's past, meant to add a bit of mystique. That was until I saw what happened to Nick. Nick was the kind of guy who lived for attention. He was loud, cocky, and always looking for the next big stunt to impress people. So when someone dared him to stay in the East Wing after 6 p.m. during detention, he jumped at the chance. "It's just an empty hallway," he said, smirking. "What's the worst that could happen?" I was there that day, watching from the cafeteria as Nick strutted down the East Wing corridor, his voice echoing off the walls. The clock struck 6, and the sunlight streaming through the windows dimmed to a reddish hue. At first, nothing happened. Nick paced back and forth, shouting into the empty hall to prove how unafraid he was. A small crowd of us watched from the entrance, giggling and whispering about how stupid the whole thing was. Then the lights flickered. It was subtle at first, a faint buzz, a flicker, then darkness for just a split second. But it was enough to make us all stop laughing. Nick froze mid-sentence, looking around as if he'd heard something. "Very funny," he called out, his voice tinged with unease. "Who's messing with the lights?" The lights flickered again, longer this time. When they came back on, Nick was staring down the hallway, his face pale. "There's someone there," he said, his voice shaking. We all squinted, trying to see what he was talking about. The hallway was empty. "Nick, stop being a baby," someone yelled. But Nick didn't move. The lights flickered again, and this time, they didn't come back on. By the time the janitor found us, Nick was gone. His backpack and phone were still lying in the middle of the hallway, but he was nowhere to be found. The teachers tried to brush it off as a prank, saying Nick had probably run off to scare us. But he didn't show up the next day, or the day after that. His parents filed a missing persons report, and the school issued a vague statement about student safety without addressing what had actually happened. That should have been the end of it, but I couldn't let it go. The night after Nick disappeared, I found myself in the school library, combing through old yearbooks and records. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That's when I stumbled across a yearbook from 1997. At first glance, it looked normal: photos of smiling students, cheesy captions, and awkward group shots. But as I flipped through the pages, I noticed something strange. Several of the student portraits had been scratched out, their names faintly visible beneath jagged lines. One of the names caught my attention: Cara Monroe. She was listed as a junior, but she didn't appear in any of the senior photos from the following year. I found a few more names like hers, all scratched out, all absent from subsequent yearbooks. It was as if they'd just vanished. I turned the page and found a note scrawled in the margins. The rules: keep it contained. Don't break them. I tried asking one of my teachers, Mr. Crane, about the scratched out photos. He was one of the older staff members, the kind of guy who'd been at the school forever. At first, he laughed off my questions. Those old yearbooks? Probably just some prank. Kids loved to scribble on things. But when I mentioned the note I'd found, his face changed. The color drained from his cheeks, and his hands trembled as he set down his coffee mug. Where did you see that? He asked, his voice low and urgent. In a yearbook, I said. What does it mean? Mr. Crane hesitated, glancing around the empty classroom as if someone might be listening. You need to let this go, he said finally. There's nothing good to find here. Just follow the rules, and you'll be fine. What happens if I don't? I pressed. He didn't answer. He just stood up, walked to the door, and locked it. When he turned back to me, his eyes were dark and hollow. Some questions are better left unanswered, he said. If you value your life, don't break the rules. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Crane's warning or Nick. It didn't make sense. None of it did. If the rules were meant to keep us safe, why didn't anyone take them seriously? Why were they buried in an old code of conduct instead of plastered on every wall? I decided to find out for myself. At exactly 6:01 p.m., I walked into the East Wing. The East Wing at 6:01 p.m. was different. I'd walked those halls hundreds of times during the day, rushing to classes or hanging out with friends, but now the air felt heavier, colder. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, their usual brightness dimmed to a sickly yellow. My footsteps echoed too loudly in the silence, the sound bouncing off the walls like it didn't belong there. I clutched my phone tightly, its flashlight barely cutting through the murkiness. Ahead, I didn't know what I was looking for. Maybe I thought I'd find Nick. Maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that nothing was there, that the rules were just stupid superstitions. But I wasn't alone. It started with the whispers. Soft at first, like someone talking just out of earshot. I froze, straining to hear, but the sound disappeared as soon as I stopped walking. I took another step. The whispers came back, louder this time, distinct enough to make out. Fragments of words. ... shouldn't. Here. I turned around, shining my flashlight back the way I'd come. The hallway was empty, but the whispers didn't stop. Nick, I called out, my voice trembling. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving the air thick with silence. For a moment I thought I'd imagined it. Then, from somewhere ahead, I heard a faint, shuffling sound like footsteps, dragging across the floor. I held my breath, shining the light toward the noise. At the far end of the hallway, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, a shadow moved. It wasn't walking. It was gliding. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't leave, not yet. The shadow disappeared into one of the side corridors, and the hallway fell silent again. I moved forward, every step a battle against the fear crawling up my spine. My flashlight flickered, casting jagged shadows on the walls. That's when I saw it. A red locker, its paint chipped and faded, standing out among the dull gray rows. The door was slightly ajar, as if someone had been in a hurry to open it but never finished. The rule flashed through my mind: never touch the red lockers, even if one is open. I should have walked away. I should have left it alone. But something compelled me to step closer. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping and urgent. Don't. Turn back. Turn back. Leave. I reached out, my hand trembling as I pushed the locker door open. Inside was a single, crumpled piece of paper. I unfolded the paper, revealing a page torn from what looked like a journal. The handwriting was shaky, scrawled across the page in uneven lines. I've broken the rules twice now. The first time, I thought it was nothing a mistake anyone could make. But the second time I saw them. They're not human. They watch from the shadows, waiting for us to slip up. The rules aren't random. They're the only thing keeping it contained. Beneath the text was a name, Kara Monroe. A chill ran down my spine. The name matched the one from the yearbook, the girl whose picture had been scratched out. The sound of footsteps broke my thoughts. They were coming from behind me, deliberate and heavy, growing louder with each passing second. I turned slowly, my flashlight flickering as the beam stretched down the empty hallway. But it wasn't empty. The figure stood at the far end of the hallway, motionless but unmistakably there. It was taller than any person should be, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The edges of its form shimmered, like smoke curling in on itself. It didn't move, but I felt its presence pressing against me, suffocating and cold. The whispers grew louder, filling my ears with overlapping voices. Go. Or run. Air now. I stumbled backward, clutching the journal page as my flashlight flickered and died. The hallway plunged into darkness. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no movement. Just the suffocating silence. Then it began to move. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing wildly as I sprinted toward the exit. The air around me seemed to ripple, the shadows on the walls stretching and twisting like they were alive. The whispers followed me, growing louder with every step. Don't look back. I reached the end of the hallway, slamming into the door that led to the main wing. It didn't budge. Panic clawed at my chest as I fumbled with the handle, my hands slick with sweat. The whispers turned into a roar, and I felt the air behind me grow colder. I didn't dare turn around. Finally, the door gave way, and I stumbled into the brightly lit main hall. The air was warmer. Here, the oppressive weight lifting as soon as I crossed the threshold. I turned back, my heart racing, but the hallway behind me was empty. The whispers were gone. The next morning, I confronted Mr. Crane. I didn't care about his warnings or the danger he had to know something. I cornered him after class, slamming the journal page down on his desk. What is this I demanded. Who is Kara Monroe? What's in the East Wing? Mr. Crane stared at the paper, his face pale. He didn't answer for a long time. Then, in a voice, barely above a whisper, he said, You shouldn't have gone there. What is it? I pressed. What are you so afraid of? He looked up at me, his eyes filled with something I hadn't seen before: fear. The rules, he said. They're not there to control you. They're there to protect you. And now, is that you've broken them. He didn't finish the sentence, but I didn't need him to. I already knew. They weren't just watching the hallways anymore. They were watching me. Mr. Crane's words haunted me long after our conversation. They're not there to control you. They're there to protect you. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd done something irreversible, something that had painted a target on my back. And as the days passed, the signs became impossible to ignore. It started small shadows flickering in my peripheral vision. The feeling of being watched when no one was around. My bedroom lights flickered at night, and my reflection in the bathroom mirror seemed delayed, as if it wasn't quite following me. But the worst was the knocking. It came every night at precisely 3 a.m. A single, deliberate knock at my bedroom door. It didn't matter that I locked it, or that my parents were asleep down the hall. Something was there, waiting. I couldn't take it anymore. If this thing was going to come for me, I needed to know what it was, what they were. I returned to the school after hours. The building was dark, the air heavy with the same oppressive silence I'd felt in the East Wing. I brought a flashlight, the journal page, and a gut full of determination. The East Wing was colder this time, the lights barely functional. The red locker stood out like a warning sign, its door now wide open. I ignored it, pressing deeper into the corridor, following the faint whispers that had returned. They led me to a door I hadn't seen before, a plain, unmarked door at the end of the hallway. Looked old, the wood warped and splintered, as if it had been there long before the rest of the school. Then, the whispers intensified as I approached, overlapping into a deafening cacophony. My hands shook as I gripped the handle, turning it slowly. The door opened with a low groan, revealing a staircase that descended into darkness. The stairs seemed to go on forever, winding downward into a space that felt impossibly large. The air grew colder with every step, and the smell of damp earth filled my nostrils. At the bottom was a vast, cavernous room, its walls covered in the same symbols I'd seen in the hallway. In the center of the room was a stone pedestal, and on it sat an ancient, leather-bound book. The whispers were deafening now, filling the space with voices that seemed to come from every direction. As I approached the pedestal, the shadows in the room began to move. They slithered along the walls and floor, coalescing into shapes that were almost human. Almost. The book's pages were filled with handwriting notes, warnings, and symbols I couldn't understand. But one line stood out, scrawled in bold letters across an entire page. The rules bind it. Breaking them sets it free. Before I could process the words, the shadows surged forward, coiling around me like smoke. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. "Why did you come back?" a voice hissed, low and guttural. I stumbled backward, clutching the journal page like it could protect me. "What are you?" I whispered. The shadows didn't answer. Instead, they swirled together, forming a single towering figure with hollow, glowing eyes. "You broke the rules," it said, its voice layered with countless others. "You let us in." The shadows lunged and I ran. I sprinted up the stairs, the whispers chasing me, growing louder with every step. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. When I reached the top, the door slammed shut behind me, cutting off the sound. I collapsed against it, gasping for breath, my heart hammering in my chest. But the silence didn't last. The whispers returned, faint but unmistakable, coming from the other side of the door. And then, I heard the sound of footsteps, growing closer. I didn't wait to see what would happen. I fled the building, the feeling of unseen eyes following me all the way home. I haven't been back to school since that night. The East Wing has been sealed off under renovation according to the administration. But I know the truth. The rules weren't just to protect us. They were to keep something contained. And now, it's free. The knocking at my bedroom door hasn't stopped. It comes every night at 3 a.m., louder and more insistent. I don't open it. I don't even look. But I know it's only a matter of time before it gets in. If you're reading this, remember the rules aren't arbitrary. They aren't a joke. They're the only thing standing between us and the darkness. And once you break them, there's no going back.